Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. It's lovely to see so many people with us after the Easter break. Having already 30 of us in the room before we've even started is amazing. So thank you to everyone who could join us today. To those who don't know me, I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Matt Baird. I've been running the Social Housing Roundtable now for the last 3 and a bit years. Initially, it started off as just a small little platform where 4 or 5 of us would come together to chat about a topic every now and then, and it's now a weekly networking forum. We discuss anything and everything in the housing space. If you're new to the roundtable, please do go and check out either the YouTube or Spotify series. You can find out all the recordings from the past year or so, or if you want to get involved as a future speaker, do also reach out. Day to day, I run a recruitment company, so I've been running Baird & Co recruitment now for 3 and a bit years. And the idea is that helps fund this and keeps it free for anyone and everyone who wishes to join. So my only favour is that if you are looking or involved in recruitment at all, please reach out, because then we can keep this running as a free platform for everybody. So on to today. To those who have been with the roundtable for a little while, you'll recognise maybe one of our speakers who's been on, which is Kelly Henderson, who I know has been on with us in the past. But Kelly introduced me to Liz, and we got chatting around domestic abuse and gambling. We ran a session with Mercy Denido on gambling last year, and some of the pressures with gambling and social housing. And Dr. Halima Sakrani as well joined us for that session. And what was fascinating when I first spoke to Liz, who's going to come in and speak to us today, was the relationship with domestic abuse and the importance of this narrative, and actually sometimes the conversations that go unseen, because I still think it's strange that we advertise gambling in such a way in this country. It's all over sport, it's all over so much media, and yet there are so many problems associated with it. So I'm not going to take up too much time. I'm delighted to welcome Liz, Riley, Kelly Henderson, Amanze Ejiogu, and our lived experience person.
I've just got a Zoom meeting going on in the background.
Just going to mute someone. There we are. And we've also got Cathy, who's going to join us today to discuss her lived experience in this session. So as always, my request is please be respectful to anything in the comments. Please feel free to put questions or queries in the chat as we go through, or raise your hand if you wish to come in and ask questions. But without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Liz to start today's session. So Liz, over to you. It's a genuine pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks very much. So I work for an organisation called Bet No More UK. We are part of the National Gambling Support Network. So we're a provider mainly of peer support services to people who are experiencing gambling harms. So I'm going to use my 10 minutes or so to kind of not do justice really to gambling harms and domestic abuse, and also touch upon issues around homelessness as well. And yeah, just the time allocation means that this is an incredibly complex area, so I can't really hope to cover much of it in much depth. I think one thing I've found whenever I talk about gambling and gambling harms is that there's nearly always somebody who says, just, what actually is gambling? And the definition is perhaps unsurprisingly very broad. So it's about risking money or something of material value with an uncertain outcome in the hope of winning more back. And it need not be money. It can be anything with material value, hence discussions that are going on around loot boxes and all that kind of stuff, or indeed gambling in prisons where there is no money. So just generally, gambling products can range from, lottery tickets to various products in the bookies, casinos, arcades, sports venues, to a huge range of products in online gambling, which is obviously escalated massively over the last 10 years, certainly. And around 50% of the British public are estimated to gamble regularly. But most of that is on the lottery, and it's associated with very low levels of spend and very little evidence of harm. And in terms of the stats related to levels of moderate and severe gambling, which can result in harms, these are quite contested, but I suppose an accepted stats would be that at least 0.5% of the English population experience gambling that is problematic. Probably around 4% are at risk of some sort of gambling harms, and an estimated 70% of the British population are negatively affected by somebody else's gambling, and that is probably the most pertinent group when it comes to talking about gambling and domestic abuse. So at its worst, harmful gambling is classified as a mental health condition and called disordered gambling. And it's recognized as a behavioral addiction. But even gambling at relatively low levels can actually cause harm. And the levels of harm experienced, they vary with the amount of time spent gambling, the amount of money relative to income, products gambled on, gambling environment, the source of the funds, and various other factors. And gambling products that have been proved to be most harmful are those that are high speed, have very short time gaps between games, they're repetitive, chance-based, and they're accessible 24 hours a day. So gambling harms themselves are not only financial, including debt and bankruptcy and acquisitive crime in order to fund gambling, but they can also be economic, impacting on employment opportunities and performance and housing stability. Harms can also be social, so damaging relationships with families, friends, colleagues, and broader communities. And there are a wide range of harms to health as well, so including physical health. So there can be an association with mental health problems such as anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, and suicide itself. And physical health harms, which can result from lack of self-care and stress. And another harm may be domestic abuse, impacting upon intimate partners, children, other family members, and sometimes the person who is actually engaged in the harmful gambling themselves. So much of the existing literature that examines gambling-related domestic abuse focuses on the intimate partner relationship. So it talks about intimate partner violence. So it can be current partner or ex-partner, and that includes physical, sexual, or psychological harm. It can include physical aggression, coercion, psychological abuse, and various controlling behaviors. And more recently, the category of economic abuse has also started to be focused upon, revealing patterns of control and exploitation or sabotage of money, finances, and economic resources. And the economic abuse is particularly pertinent when we're considering gambling-related intimate partner violence. And looking beyond intimate partners, you can also think about domestic and family violence, which is a bit broader. But very similar types of abuse are evident. So physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, verbal abuse, social abuse, financial abuse, harassment and stalking as well, whether in person or online. And it can be between family members as well as being directed at intimate partners, children, parents. So gambling, I think the evidence is showing that gambling can have significant effects on intimate and family relationships, including the erosion of trust and increases in tension and conflict, especially arguments around gambling losses, which can lead to abuse and violence. Gambling harms can be especially damaging to children when they're exposed to financial hardship and emotional deprivation, physical isolation, poor parenting, poor role modeling, family conflict, and reduced housing and financial security and stability. And family members who are affected by somebody else's gambling are also more likely to report poor mental and physical health, risky substance abuse, low levels of social support, and they may also be engaging in harmful gambling themselves. So when harmful gambling and domestic abuse come together, the research to date shows that there are two main categories. One is the person who gambles. They are the perpetrator of the abuse, which can be financial, economic, emotional, physical, all the types of abuse that I've mentioned before. And the second pattern is where the person who gambles is themselves a victim of abuse, and that abuse can either be current or historical. So they may be gambling to escape the trauma of abuse, or they may be being subjected to abuse because they are gambling. One of the academics who has led research in this area is Riley Hing, who's mainly focused on Australia. But she has done reviews of all the evidence that has been published to date. So amongst samples of treatment seekers experiencing harmful gambling, domestic and family violence perpetration rates in Australia, for example, ranged from 19 to 49%. In New Zealand, it was around 42%. And in the UK, 12% of gambling treatment seekers reported perpetrating intimate partner violence. Gamma Non is the kind of affected other side of Gamblers Anonymous, so it can be for partners and other family members, and they have reported that 50% of people that attend Gamma Non meetings report physical or verbal abuse by their spouse who gambles. And in Canada, there is evidence that around 56% of adults with a gambling problem report using physical assault, injury, or sexual coercion against an intimate partner in the last year. Just briefly, I'm gonna get away from the stats in a minute, but just looking at the population studies in more broadly. In Australia, just under 20% of problem or moderate risk gamblers reported perpetrating domestic or family violence in the last 12 months. And that compares with around 9% of non-gamblers. While in the UK, there's a survey that showed a 9% rate of past 5-year family violence perpetration amongst UK males, which was 19% for females. So gambling-related domestic abuse often begins with anger and arguments over gambling, which can lead to an increase in verbal and emotional abuse. That in itself can lead to an escalation of gambling problems, and then there can be physical and sexual violence. Intimate partner violence, as I've said before, also includes financial abuse. And I think that an interesting thing as well is that the physical and the sexual violence can also be used in conjunction with the financial abuse. These types of abuses can often reinforce each other. And there are also in the UK cases of gambling-related murder as well within the family. So just briefly returning to the work of Riley Hing, she's shown that almost half cases of intimate partner violence involve economic abuse, and that women are twice as likely as men to be the victims of that economic abuse. And there are two overarching types. So there can be economic exploitation of the partner's resources in order to gamble. But there can also be economic control, so restricting that partner's ability to access and use resources. So gambling-related domestic abuse is significantly gendered. And there is evidence that men who hold stricter views on gender roles and other patriarchal attitudes towards gender and women are more likely to perpetrate violence, including economic abuse, against female partners. And there is also, it's just staying with that gendered angle, evidence that women gamble to escape intimate partner violence. So they're seeking refuge in physical gambling environments, such as casinos, as a safe space. But they may also be gambling themselves to escape emotionally, or in the hope of winning big in order that they can acquire sufficient resources, financial resources, to enable them to leave the relationship. And there is a range of studies that show higher victimization rates amongst women with a gambling problem than men. So I'm going to just use my last couple of minutes just talking a little bit around gambling and homelessness in all its forms. So gambling harms are far more common amongst people experiencing homelessness, with almost 1 in 5 people in homelessness experiencing some sort of clinical level of gambling harm. Gambling can obviously be a direct cause of homelessness. So a person can be evicted from their housing because they've not paid their rent or their mortgages or bills due to their spending on gambling. And this pathway into homelessness is often triggered by quite significant and maybe even rapid losses from high intensity gambling. But gambling can also contribute to homelessness due to its impact on relationship breakdown, domestic abuse, criminal convictions, child neglect, and obviously contributing to homelessness in that way. So I think the other thing before I finish is to also mention that gambling can actually result from homelessness as a coping mechanism to alleviate boredom, or again, in the hope of winning in order to escape homelessness. And I think what becomes quite clear when you're looking at the link with homelessness is the kind of vicious circle that can exist. So it can be harder for people to escape homelessness because of their gambling, but people who are homeless and gambling also make it find that it's much harder to actually enter into recovery because of the insecurity of their housing situation. So I'm actually going to stop because this kind of segues nicely onto what Cathy is going to talk to you about now. And Cathy has her own lived experience. So Cathy, over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I don't know where you want me to start. So I'll start at the beginning. I was from a broken home, and my mother was very abusive. Unfortunately, she was an undiagnosed mental person, and so from a baby, I was very much neglected or shouted at, and my dad just went to Brighton and escaped. He was a bit of a gambler. My grandmother's partner was a gambler. And so I sort of saw casinos, and I was taken at a young age to betting shops. Even way then they weren't so strict, you could sort of sit in a pram, or I was just around that sort of gambling environment. It was very normal. We did the football pools every week. We went to arcades at holidays. If we, only went in England to B&B, and we always sort of played in amusement arcades, and did horse bets at weekends. My grandmother always got the sun, and we, followed, Templeton, Stargate, and it was very much normal to gamble in the family, and everything was we were always short of money. My dad sort of did get rich schemes, which really were get poor schemes, really. He was very much a risk taker, didn't want to work 9 to 5. So we didn't have that steady, stable environment, which now before I didn't realize that stability was important. I just thought you had to make lots of money. Everything in my household was about money. How much money did you make today? How much, I was selling sweets out of my bedroom or, you know, when I went to school, you know, I had a year at private school and boarding school. Then I was in another school. So I had no stability. Every year I was in a different school. This was all because of my mother not liking the teachers or not liking something. And so I had to move schools. And then in the end, because of my dad's instability with money, um, you know, we ended up with nothing and we were living with my grandmother. Um, so I never really felt like I had a home. We're in different houses all the time and not our own houses. Um, so, you know, I just grew up. I was playing fruit machines at 10, because you were allowed to in coffee shops and kebab shops. And yeah, I just seemed to escape the torture of my mother shouting, because I was so scared of her. I used to hide under the bed, and she, you know, would just shout all the time. She just was had hypomania, manic depression, psychotic paranoia, but she was totally untreated because the mental health system then, you didn't have to go to the doctors um, unless, you know, somebody dragged you there. And so she never thought she had a problem, and everything was my father's fault or my fault. And then my father, as I say, he was always escaping everything and just running away from it. And he just left me there with my mum. So I would say that was my first abuser. Um, and, you know, an absent father, unfortunately. Um, and then by the time I was 15, I was in a children's home. And then I learned to get money. You know, again, everything was about having money. I didn't get pocket money or have any resources. I played the piano to fund my sort of sports and hobbies, and I was fortunate. I earned £15 an hour at 15 in the 80s. That was a lot of money, and but I went to the betting shop and sort of did dog bets and spoke to all these old men, and you know, it was like probably they were like paedophiles, but I was so naive, I had no idea. So I was just friendly with all these old men, and that became my life, because, you know, I was very lonely in the children's home, and quite, you know, from going to private school to being in a very rough, um, you know, rough home. Um, it was quite, it was quite hard. So I really escaped again using gambling, but because I was successful at it, well, I thought I was because I've sort of invested in shares and things like that. Um, you know, by the time I was 18, I had enough money to go to America and Australia. So wasn't as dependent on gambling. When I went to America, it was much better because I didn't know any gambling there, or Australia. So I actually had a break from gambling, which was really good. And I did well at university and chose to go back to university because I wasn't guided. You know, from 15, I just, you know, played tennis and um, became a coach, and um, in America, and played piano as well. So I was, you know, was making good money, so I didn't think so much about gambling. But as soon as I came home at 22 and tried to help my mother, because she had a terrible breakdown and she had to go to mental hospital finally, and so I came back from Australia, the worst thing I probably ever did, because I was so much healthier being away from my abuser, I suppose. I never called her that, but looking at the way, and then I suppose now would be called an abuser, how I've behaved with money. So it's horrible to think that over the years this gambling addiction got worse. It was I always sort of binged when I was working and having my own business, and was pretty successful. But there was always that element in me with relationships. If I was unhappy with a relationship, I always attracted the wrong people. I attracted people who were totally emotionally unavailable. And so they were either trying to get back their ex, or married, or, you know, they weren't free for me. So I just ended up gambling. And that cost me, you know, basically all my earnings went on gambling. But because I was earning so much, it didn't really matter. You know, it obviously would now. I wish I'd saved those earnings and been stable, but then I just lived for the moment and, you know, carried on making money. I never bought a house till my mother needed help. It was always my parents who had to come and live with me, which was another thing that just made my gambling worse, because these were the people that made my life miserable in many ways. My dad was always wanting money off me, and his investments, like, had 30,000 off me to do some, you know, he was such a good salesman. He sold me this idea, and I invested all my savings, and then, you know, it was 8 books, and it was a totally stupid business, but he convinced me that, you know, he begged me for this money, and then that was ruined. And so when you lose money as a gambler, you know, even though it was for business, it just, yeah. Anyway, I could tell you a million stories. There's not enough time. I try and get to the point about homelessness and domestic abuse. When I became like 40, I had been raped, so that totally ruined my mental health. And I was pregnant over it. So this was all from coming out of a casino at 3 o'clock in the morning. There were no trains or anything, and there were 5 men, and they attacked me, and I ended up, I wasn't aware of it at the time, but you know, I was raped, and then I got pregnant. I didn't know for 3 months until that I was pregnant, and then that just ruined my life, really, because it totally ruined my mental health. And by then, my business skills, because I had a sports business, had a very bad car accident, which I think probably was caused by being so overwhelmed with my emotions over this rape. And then you know, I had a very bad car accident, and then couldn't do my business, which was based on my physical health. And then I lived with my mother, and who was my worst abuser, and then ended up going online, losing masses of money, and ruining my life, basically. And then was tied to housing with my mother, which just, you know, made my gambling worse. You know, I got help from Gordon Moody, I got help from Betnamo, I got help from many organizations, but I didn't realize I was neurodivergent. So I didn't realize I had a mental health problem. I couldn't get much support at that time, other than the physical support, physiotherapy and things like that. And yeah, it wasn't till sort of Gordon Moody went online that I sort of actually got somewhere, because before I couldn't cope with just Gamblers Anonymous, and there wasn't even one near me, and I was physically could barely move. I couldn't turn my neck for 2 years. I was in a neck brace, so everything sort of went to pot by then. So to summarize, between 43 and 54, I've been like sofa surfing. My dad finally got a council house, and I stayed with him for a bit, but then he got a girlfriend, and then I had to move out. And you know, I've been trying to get rooms and houses and everything, but you know, I can't work much now. My mental health, physical health is so bad. I have fibromyalgia, I have arthritis, I have chronic pain. It's, you know, I have so many diseases that it's not worth mentioning, but I just not myself anymore. And I'm not that woman who had a business and had energy and You know, I just found that, you know, late in life that I'm neurodivergent. The housing situation is terrible. There is no housing stock. Everything, the government is like, tries to disqualify you from being eligible to be on the register. And even if you're on the register, in my area, there is like one house becomes available a month, or even a bed sit, nothing there. And there's like 10,000 and they've just closed the list. So there's literally no hope. So it's very, very difficult for people who've, you know, had bad relationships. I'm glad I haven't got children to worry about, and, you know, at least, but as a single person at 54, you are very limited to getting back on track, because rent is like 1,300 a month around here for just a 1-bedroom flat. A room is £850. And, you know, I have, you know, being diagnosed and my doctor signed me off for work permanently. I'm registered disabled, you know, and there's nothing. And so it's a really hard legacy of gambling harms. You know, I haven't been gambling. You know, I relapsed many, many times between 40 and 50, because I just didn't realize I had this really ADHD, which makes you very irrational. And so, you know, could not gamble for ages. And then I just have this binge in one of my manias. So I've had to learn a lot over the last few years. And, you know, I've sought every help that there is out there, to get through, to survive, because mentally it's hard to survive, you know, not having your own home, to not have the hope of having your own home, to know you financially, you know, I'm not going to, you know, my parents have nothing. I'm not going to ever be left anything. I don't have lots of relatives. And so I'm glad that I haven't abused lots of people, because I don't have lots of family to abuse, and borrow money off. And my parents really borrowed money off me all the time. And if life hadn't been all about money, maybe things would have been different. We'd have had a different mindset, but they made me who I was. They made me like be this person who just had to think that how much money, that's the question, how much money do you make per day? And that just makes you, unfortunately, have a money addiction.
Thank you, Cathy. I think it's you've been incredibly brave sharing that, and I just want to do. I know we'll come back to it, and I can see I'm having private messages come through already saying thank you so much for that. I want to make sure we've got time for some questions and for some insight for whatever more you're willing to share. And I know Kelly and Amanze are going to come in and share some of the research that they've been doing, but just from me and from everyone in the comments, a massive thank you to you for sharing that, because that's an incredibly powerful story. Kelly, I'm going to pass on to yourself to introduce some of the work around domestic abuse before Amanze talks about the research that's going on in this exact space, and then we've got some time for questions. So Kelly, over to you, but thank you again, Cathy.
Thank you, Cathy. Oh my goodness, how do you follow that? I could have listened kind of all day. So I'm going to keep my part really brief. I've produced some slides, which Matt, if you're able to send them on afterwards, which has kind of got some more information in, because I'm sure everybody will have questions for Cathy. I know I do. So obviously, I'm from Addressing Domestic Abuse, and we carry out research, evaluation and training around domestic abuse. And I have taken part in a previous roundtable, and I recognise some of the names and some of the faces today. So obviously, we are part of the research that Amanze is going to outline. And my background, as most of you might know, is all around kind of domestic abuse and housing. That's been my big passion. So working with Liz and hearing Cathy's story has kind of just really made it clear to me about how many kind of crossovers there are. And our new research together is looking at gambling related domestic abuse, but just looking at things in terms of housing and domestic abuse. You know, I think we also, the definition of domestic abuse within the Domestic Abuse Act highlighted economic abuse, which Liz has mentioned. Looking at the stats around domestic abuse and housing. Again, I'll forward these slides on, but just some of them. Last year in the Observer, there was a point made that over 10,000 women escaping domestic abuse across England were refused housing in the last year. So just hearing about kind of the importance of that stability that Cathy talked about as a victim survivor of domestic abuse, that's very similar, and being able to kind of close your own front door and kind of feel safe kind of is the basis for recovery. So I think there's some kind of definite crossovers there. And obviously, if you work in housing, you will be aware that from yesterday, the consumer standards came into play, and we saw the neighbourhood and community standard, which sets out that if you are a housing provider, you've got to have a domestic abuse policy, and you've got to work in partnership with the local authority around safe accommodation strategies as well. So at Addressing Domestic Abuse, we've been doing a little bit of research, and it'd be great if you could all fill in this survey. And what we were asking people was, do you have a domestic abuse policy? And our research found that actually only 69% of those people who surveyed actually said they do. So from yesterday, you've got to have one. So we'll be interested to see kind of what people are doing around recognising domestic abuse. We also found that in terms of training, only 21% said that all customer-facing staff had been trained, so only a fifth of staff have been trained to recognise domestic abuse. So what we're hoping to do around domestic abuse and housing is to kind of carry out further research in this field, but also Amanze is going to talk about our kind of joint research with the gambling harms as well. So I'm going to leave it there, and as I say, I'll forward on the slides so that we've got time to ask Cathy lots of questions, because I can see lots of chat coming up with questions. So I'll now hand back, and I'll just forward on the slides, which has got everything on there.
No, thank you, Kelly. That's really important. I think it's that message of you have to have a domestic abuse policy, but just having a basic one also isn't going to be good enough anymore. It needs to be robust. So please do reach out to Kelly and look at this, because gambling is a big part of it. But Amanze, I'm going to pass over to you to talk about the research you've been undertaking lately.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Kelly, Liz, and Kath for sharing. I think coming out of, listening to Liz and Kath and Kelly, we kind of see gambling and gambling harms and the problems which emanate from these. And we also see how they intersect with housing. But what we're finding was, in policy space, in the research space, there's an understanding of gambling and gambling harms growing every day. Also an understanding of domestic abuse. But those linkages between gambling harms and domestic abuse, and those linkages, gambling harms, domestic abuse, and social housing are not very clear. And we don't seem to understand those linkages. We don't, and unless we understand those linkages, we cannot provide the kind of support which people require, which people need. And so what we've done, Kelly, Liz, myself, Mercy Denedo, we've kind of brought together a research team to say, let's look at these intersections between gambling, domestic abuse, and social housing. Let's try to understand those linkages. Let's try to see how we can support survivors better. Let's try to see what we can do to help social housing providers understand their responsibility towards these people, how they can identify them early on, and how we can then build support around them. So basically, that's what this research project is trying to do. And what we're doing as a start is to try to understand the lived experiences of people who've experienced domestic abuse, gambling-related domestic abuse in the social housing context. And as we progress that, we're also going to then, start to speak with housing providers and others within the social housing sector to understand, what kind of policies they have in place, what kind of support they have in place, where the gaps are, and how we can kind of bridge those gaps. So I think that's kind of what we're trying to do right now. We have, I think, Liz and Kelly, we have a number of surveys online already, and we'll pass across the links for those. But I think basically what we will be asking is for support to help us identify people who we can speak with, or inroads into organizations, social housing providers, and others in the sector who we can speak with and who can participate in this research project. Yeah. I think
thank you, Amanze. So both there have been 2 surveys shared in the chat. So please do fill those out. Also, if you're part of the mailing list, I'll make sure they go round. And then Liz has shared a form there so that to get in touch regarding Bet No More and the work that they're undertaking. Yeah, sorry, Amanze, back to you.
No, I was saying I think Liz has put the survey in the box, in the chat box. So and it's what we're trying to do is to try to see if we can generate or raise more participants for the survey. So we'll be grateful for any help there, either in disseminating the information, passing the link across to anyone you think could be involved, or putting us in touch with anybody in organizations or contacts you have. That'll be really useful to us.
Thank you very, very much. That brings kind of an end to our speakers for today, but obviously not the end of the session. We've got about 15 minutes now for questions and everything else. What I do want to do is someone had emailed me privately to ask about the recording. So anything we share through this part, it is being recorded, but it's going to be edited. So obviously I'm going to speak to Cathy, see what she'd like, if there's any part she'd like editing. But if anyone does wish to share something today, but then have it edited out before the recording, please let me know, because this is going to be one of the first ones we're doing in a while that doesn't immediately get uploaded, to make sure that anything shared is obviously safe and confidential. So I just wanted to reinforce that before we go into questions. I'll go to those in the chat first in terms of the questions that have arisen, but if anyone would like to bring in and to speak, please do use, there's a button at the bottom of your screen saying reactions. If you click on that and then raise hand, that will bring you in. So a question that comes from Tony to our panel in general: do you find that gambling is a hidden vice? That might be why it causes violence when it's discovered. Liz, maybe you're the best one to bring in on this one initially.
Yeah, it is kind of known as being the hidden addiction, because there are obviously no kind of immediate physical signs of somebody gambling, unlike a substance addiction. And yes, certainly that discovery of the gambling, especially if it's reached a particularly harmful level, can be a moment of a violent reaction. But I would suggest that maybe prior to discovery, there can be also a lot of other types of abuse: the economic abuse, the financial abuse, emotional manipulation of the person. So yeah, the moment of discovery is a moment of heightened risk. But also there can be moments of physical violence that are associated with big losses as well. Somebody was telling me the other day in one of the interviews that I conducted for the research that Amanze's told you about, was a woman walked into a living room where her partner was betting on football and just to see if he wanted a cup of tea. However, he'd just lost big as a result of somebody scoring a goal, and next minute, objects were flying through the air at her and he was smashing up the room. So it can be, the violence can be in reaction to a loss as well as discovery of the addiction.
Thank you. I mean, I know we've spoken about this. I spoke about this with the panel before. When I was much younger, just after I graduated, I needed a job. I lived in the Lake District. I worked in a bookies for a year. Didn't really think anything of it, but you see such contrasting emotions, such highs and lows, such variety of wind, and that's just in the shop. never mind what people like when they take that home, and there's often, you know, the relationship with drinking and gambling as well. So I think it's really important to highlight that. Before I go to the next question, I'm going to bring in Kelly though. Kelly, do please dive in.
Sorry, I couldn't get myself off mute there. I've just popped the slides in the chat as well. And I just wondered if I could just ask Cathy a question. Just that I think probably lots of us are thinking about, if that's okay, Cathy. I was just thinking about kind of you touched upon that housing instability, and I just kind of wanted to explore that a little more, just kind of the impact that you think that's had. If I could ask that question, please, if you would like to answer it, of course.
Yeah, no, that of course, no, because it's a realization that and it sounds so obvious, but I had sort of years and years of different sort of counseling and therapies, but I really didn't realize that you know, a lot of my thought process, and you know, to be such a risk taker, I think if you don't have anything to if you're not accountable, and if you don't have the roots and like a stable base and that community, and it, you know, and you just basically, I felt like a drifter really all my life. And it's so important to have roots and have a stable base. And the instability, you know, it made me realize that I was just gambling to try and raise money for this year in advance rent you had to find, and also because my health went as well, but yeah, the instability is a huge factor. And many people I know, women who are gambling, you know, and have bad housing, you know, that bad housing thing is a real trigger and a real carrot to try and make you gamble for a long period of time. It's a hard thing to give up when you just have that sort of slight hope that you might get the money for this rent you need in advance now. And now you need a guarantor to earn 43,000 in my area. And yeah, the instability is a big factor. And I didn't realize how unstable my life was all those years, and that I had never had stability. So if somebody doesn't know how to make stability, you almost in treatment, you need to be taught stability, about grounding, about not just mentally, but just learning about stability, because it's like an alien subject.
It's, I mean, Liz, I don't know if you want to dive in on that one as well. I saw you come off mute. Is there anything you'd like to add from the Bet No More side of things? Is this something you see often?
It is something that we see often, yes. The any sort of housing instability can make entering into recovery from gambling just that much harder. But also we see it from the other point of view as well, of people affected by somebody else's gambling, that they can and do lose their houses, or the burden can fall on their shoulders to try and keep the house and the family together. So they may take on a second job. They can be coerced into committing crime. We've seen examples of that, in order to help, you know, secure resources so that people can stay in the home, as well as securing resources through crime in order for their partner to carry on gambling. So, you know, it's incredibly complex, but the housing dimension does come into a lot of people's stories in one way or the other. There may not be a loss of the house, but that fear of losing the home is present in most people, I would say.
There's a question that's coming from the chat from Judith. I don't mind which of the panel wish to dive in on this one. I don't know, Amanze, whether this has come up in your research or anything like that, or Liz. If people are gambling to escape in a casino, for example, in your opinion, should casinos remove facial recognition software, so stop collecting face biometrics, since it means the most vulnerable people are having their biometrics taken? I don't mind who would like to come in on that one.
I read that question about 3 times when I saw it in the software and thought, oh God, I don't think I'm qualified to answer this. However, what I will say in response to Judith, that I think the most important thing that all land-based gambling establishments can do is provide proper training to their staff to not only recognise the signs of harmful gambling amongst their customers, but also any issues around domestic abuse as well, because at the moment there is insufficient recognition and insufficient training in a lot of establishments of how to actually intervene in a meaningful way as well. So I'm sorry, I've not really answered your question.
No, absolutely fine. Amanze, I'll bring you in, and I'm going to go to Cathy.
I think that a number of things at play here. One is, how do we support people in a way which is not intrusive in their privacy? So what's the balance which you strike between protection of personal data and trying to support people, trying to, in a sense, even exclude people who from certain areas. And some of that can only be kind of tackled at kind of policy level. And they are difficult questions to answer. Yeah.
They are. Cathy, I'm going to bring you in before going to Richard, and then there's a couple of points I'd like to raise in the chat. So Cathy, over to you.
I have to say that I'm grateful for the photographs and facial recognition in casino, because years ago I tried to get in, and because of their photographic recognition, they didn't allow me in when I was barred. And that is a blessing, because it took me years, it took me a long time to be strong enough to bar myself in casino. And if I was allowed in and start that thing of being there till 3 a.m, it's bad. And I know a lot of people who've been saved by that. This self-exclusion really does help somebody with that obsessive addiction. So it, facial recognition stops a lot of people getting in who shouldn't get in, because in betting shops, they're letting in so many people who are self-excluded, even though they have photos. But this sort of, the casino with the barrier and the gateway and your passport and everything, they're much more thorough, and they seem to stop people getting in if they have that technology, rather than the bookies and arcades who are letting people in. I know for a fact friends are still gambling who get in with, at places they're self-excluded.
Thank you very much. Richard, I'm going to bring you in, and then I'm going to go to the chat.
Thanks, Matt. It was just on that aspect of training that was mentioned. I think there's a comment in the chat about professional curiosity. So I manage an income team, and also our tenancy sustainment team, or I do our benefit advice, and we do more commonly go through income expenditures and the like with people. So this thing about, we've been discussing here about losing housing, I want to keep people in their homes, and obviously this is an important thing that very possibly some of our customers are clearly have got issues with. So if anyone on the call or could point me in the right direction of sort of soft skill training or whatever, awareness training for my team, that's what I think is going to be beneficial. This problem's not going away anytime soon, is it? So I think we're pretty, my team are pretty well drilled on most of the things they have to deal with. But I think this is something that's becoming bigger and wider, and something that I want to start addressing with them to make sure they've got that skill set. So if anyone can help, that would be really, really lovely.
Well, the person I always recommend for that is just raise their hand. So Kelly, do please come in.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, Richard. That can certainly help on some elements of that, and some of the associates that I work with as well might be able to help. So if you want,
Brilliant.
we can have a conversation afterwards. I'll just give you some of the things that we're finding out from the survey already, which said, when you're signing up somebody, which might be of interest to Richard, when you're signing up somebody, we've asked questions. Do you ask a question about gambling at the sign-up time? And only 41% of people who answered the survey said they ask that question around gambling. In terms of domestic abuse, 58% ask about domestic abuse at the sign-up time. So we're hoping that by people filling in the surveys, that we'll get a lot more information. Then we'll see what some of the gaps that you've talked about, Richard, are that you're trying to kind of resolve. And, you know, and I think from being from a social housing background, we develop such unique relationships with our customers, where you kind of, you can create that kind of bond where you might be the conduit to provide that support for somebody to get that, you know, that expert help that people like Bet No More might provide. But they might never pick up the phone or go on a website and think, oh yeah, I'm going to do that. But having that relationship, and I think the more we know in housing about those specialist organisations, the better. Then we can much more effectively signpost and support people to access those specialist services. So I'll get your details off Matt afterwards, and we can have a further conversation.
So I'll put my email in the chat. Thanks ever so much.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you both. So for the last couple of minutes, I'll go through some of the amazing stories I've shared in the chat. So thank you, everybody. But so Gabby, as someone who came to the UK from abroad in 2011, I was absolutely so surprised of how much of a normal part of society gambling is here. I still cannot comprehend it, to be fair. Betting shops in a row on every corner, going to a football game. I was the only one not on my phone, it felt, keeping track of bets, being able to bet on everything down to the name of some royal's new child. It's no surprise that people don't recognise it as a danger because it's so pervasive and part of everyone's life. And of that, I couldn't agree more. The idea that we have such stringent laws against footballers betting, and yet we have betting companies sponsoring the football is it's just wild. Judith, thanks for the response. I think my wider point is if some of the most vulnerable people are in there in the casinos, and you're effectively making them more vulnerable when that data is breached, potentially exposing them to high levels of harm, should you still put them in that position, or should you stop doing it to protect them better? And it's a really interesting debate. Caroline, it really highlights to me the importance of professional curiosity and the role that we can all play in terms of asking the right questions to be able to provide timely support to victims and survivors, both professionals in the housing and homelessness sector and the gambling industry. Also, the financial cost alone of domestic abuse is so huge. Our ability to overcome those financial barriers to housing is so vital for survivors. Judith, there are other less privacy intrusive ways of keeping people out when they are barred, like stuff on the doors and photos. You arguably don't need facial recognition. It's a really interesting one, the facial recognition piece. I've known people myself who've barred themselves, and they said the best thing, it very much echoes Cathy's point, which was they couldn't get in. They were like, right, well, I've got to go home then, was the way that they stopped. Sharon, thank you to the panel and especially Cathy for sharing your experience of gambling. It is clear there is a need for more research on how social housing providers can support those experienced domestic abuse due to gambling, which is why it was amazing we could bring everyone to the table today. And Liz has said Rachel Courtney Williams is one of the best trainers, her organisation's SUDTA. And like I say, I will always advocate for Kelly and the work that you do in your business. That has come to the end of today's session. I normally kind of say, you know, what would people like, you know, what's the immediate takeaway? But I think the obvious takeaway is to get those surveys filled in, to support the research, and then just to listen and think of, you know, more ways to kind of go, how can we incorporate some of the information we've had today into actually making change? So reach out to Liz at Bet No More. That's Bet, K-N-O-W, More. Reach out to Kelly Henderson. Reach out to Amanze. A massive thank you to Cathy for being so vulnerable and open today and for sharing everything you have as well. As I say, the recording will go live in a few days. I just want to check with everybody that what we're sharing is okay. But for now, a massive thank you to everyone who could join us today. A massive thank you to our panel. We had nearly 50 people in the room today, which is absolutely amazing. I've just been asked what next week's session topic is, and so I'll quickly pull that one up. And next week we'll be discussing creating a psychologically safe culture in work. So actually probably tied in with a lot of the conversation today around, can we openly talk about some of these sessions and some of these issues when we're in work? So again, thank you to everybody. Look forward to seeing you all at a future roundtable, but for now, take care. I'll stop the recording. Cheers.